Good evening, Master Class. And I say evening because we're recording the 5 o'clock session today. The earlier class we did not record because of technical difficulties at the park. So we were unable to do that this morning. So today you'll get a customized version and we'll do the best of the morning. So today we just have Brent and LaDanta joining us. So it'll be, everybody will get to have all their questions and thoughts answered. So one of the places we're going to start is just talking about American politics. It'll be a short discussion on American politics. When you change presidents, what always happens to the previous president? They get criticized. Anything they did that was good gets downplayed, and the current president always gets upplayed. And especially if it's a different party.
And they get blamed for everything.
And they get blamed. Whoever's gone is blamed for everything. So we're going to see if we don't see a little bit of that in the Bible today. And part of my goal here is to try to convince you that Saul was a pretty good king and that David was probably overstated a little bit, but also to talk about what's the difference in a good king and a bad king, and what standards would you use for a good king and a bad king. So we're in the book of 1 Samuel. Want to just talk overall about what makes a good king and a bad king and how that played out in Saul's life. So as we all know, Saul was the first king of Israel. And Saul did not have any rules to play by. He had some things he wasn't supposed to do, but there was really no rule book for Saul. There was no predecessor. So where did Saul learn how to become king? Where did he get his models from? And go ahead, or LaDanta, either one.
I was just going to say, I think Samuel probably helped him quite a bit with wisdom, and I think.
That's a good point. We're going to come right back to that. Brent, what were you going to say?
Well, I hadn't answered that question directly, but my thought is maybe by looking around and seeing some of the other kings and how they behaved.
Exactly. So that would have been his role model. So what you would have thought would be his role model was just what LaDanta said, is that Samuel would have been the one to teach Saul how to be king. Is that what we saw when you read the Bible? Did Samuel like Saul? Did Samuel hang around, want to be his role model? When Saul went off the rails, he'd bring him back? Or did we see a Samuel that pretty much stays distant from Saul?
It's a good question. Don't we see that they stayed in different cities?
Yep.
So I don't think they were together a whole lot. Doesn't sound like.
Yeah. And one of the very first things that we note in there is that Saul, when he disobeyed Samuel about offering the sacrifice, it looks like from that point on, Samuel pretty well washes his hands of Saul. So I think a lot of what the problem is Saul doesn't have anybody telling him what to do. Certainly nobody to keep him in check. And so I think that part of the blame, I think you can lay at Samuel's feet, actually. Now that's my personal take, and you certainly don't have to go with it. The other thing I think we see that, so I'm going to lay out a whole bunch of points that are going to seem disconnected, and then eventually they may connect up. Book of Chronicles was written after the exile, or at least toward the end of the exile, when the Jews were having trouble getting people to go back to Judah, to Jerusalem. Life was pretty good in Babylon. Now, why do they need to go back to Judah and Jerusalem? So I think a lot of it was political spin to say, oh, back when David was king, things were awesome. This is what's going to be, and again, we're going to rebuild the temple, where everything's going to be great. We're going to be our own kingdom again. And I think they used David as a role model to say, it's going to be just like when David was there. Things are going to be good again. So that's a big part of what's going on here. So you see, especially in Chronicles, David gets pumped up when Saul gets beat up pretty bad. In fact, in Chronicles, Saul just gets, I think, one chapter. He's just almost bypassed, which is an interesting point because how long was Saul king?
40 years.
One account says 40 years, somewhere between 20 and 40 years. So he was king a long time. What do we know about Saul? Basically, 4 instances, all of them which put Saul in a negative light. Right?
Put Saul in what did you say, Phil?
A negative light. So they, it's when he disobeys, it's when he does something wrong. And then overall, it's the idea that he's persecuting David. So everything about Saul is negative if you just look at what's presented. And I think that is on purpose, just like we would do politically. Now, let's talk about some of the good things Saul did. You have any good things that Saul did that come to mind?
The video gave us some options, some nice options. Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead, Linda. I'm sorry.
He brought all the tribes together.
Right. Good.
By the way, on that point, when we were watching the video, Hannah at one point said that's a little bit like the colonies in the United States, how you had these independent colonies that had to get pulled together, which I thought was a cool point. But
that was a great point for Hannah. Good. So he brought the tribes together as a nation.
He did worship the Lord, even though he disobeyed. As the video points out, he didn't lead them to false gods or idols.
That's right. Yeah, he maybe wasn't the best worshiper of God, but he didn't lead them into false worship. What did when he became king? What was it that the Israelites asked for? They wanted 2 things from their king. Do you remember?
To be like everyone else.
Good. To be like everyone else and to
lead them in battle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So did they get what they asked for?
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. They got exactly a king, very similar to the people around them, and somebody who led them into battle.
I thought it was a great point, by the way, that you tied in the human part of Samuel and his sons and why he would feel rejected by that. Of course, he knew his sons were not following in his ways. But anyway, great. Another great
point. And Samuel, that's another reason Samuel probably rejected Saul, or at least didn't like him. He wanted his sons to be leading. He didn't want Saul to be leading. So if you guys have your map of Israel by any chance, I didn't ask you to have it, but if you happen to have it during the Davidic kingdom, which I think is either map 5 or 6.
Yeah, map 5.
And you don't have to have it, Ladant, if it's hard to find, but.
I got one here.
Okay, good. So let's talk about when we talk about Saul leading the Israelites into battle. Let's talk about the different groups that he battled. So the first one, I'm going to start on the clock and go counterclockwise. So at 8 to 9 o'clock, who is Saul battling?
Philistines.
The Philistines, right? Then when you come around to about 7 o'clock, 6 o'clock and 7 o'clock, he's fighting the Amalekites. It's probably not on your map, but that's mostly where the Amalekites were, or Amalekites, however you want to say it. Then at about 5 o'clock, who does he fight there?
Moabites.
Before Ammonites. The Edomites.
Edomites, yeah.
Edomites, the Moabites, the Ammonites. You just go around the clock. He fought almost everybody easily except up to the north. So what you really see is Saul's entire career is built fighting the surrounding countries. And Israel survives through that whole time. So I think you could have made a case if it hadn't been for Saul, Israel may, never have been surviving at all. But the other thing that Saul did was he probably helped the farmers of Israel, and shepherds, become warriors, or at least get some experience in battle. So now when David comes to the throne, which we'll see next week, and we go around the same clock, which is almost exactly the order probably that David fought them. David beats the Israelites, he beats the Amalekites. Well, he beats the Amalekites first, actually. Then the Philistines, then the Edomites, Moabites, Ammonites. You just go around and David beats them all. But possibly that's because Saul helped weaken them while he was helping build up Israel. So David's success has, I think, something to do with uh, Saul's success. The other thing that you see that's going on is a battle for technology. Now, this is going to be really hard to see. So if you have your map, we'll show you a couple of things. So we're going to talk about trade and technology. And I'm going to start with trade, and then we'll go to technology. So on trade, we just said that the Philistines were on the plains, right? At Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gaza, so on. But when we're in 1 Samuel, where is Saul going to die? Where's the battle? Where does Jonathan take over the
Mount Gilboa, right?
Mount Gilboa? Where's Mount Gilboa?
Right up here by north of Shechem.
Yeah. So what's happened is the Philistines have taken over all the way over to the Jordan River. Right? They've taken over the Jezreel Valley. They've taken over the best part of Israel. That also happens to be where the trade route runs, the major trade route, the Via Maris, runs up the coast, then over to Damascus. And when it comes through Damascus, it's probably running through the Jezreel Valley, by just north of Mount Gilboa, up on the west side of the Sea of Galilee, and then on over to Damascus. So I think what has happened is the Philistines have become very powerful because they took over the trade route. And by taking over the trade route, they've been able to keep the Israelites poor because they had the best of the land. So when the Israelites start revolting against the Philistines, this is not going to happen. We're not going to give up our trade route. And we're going to continue to dominate you. And one way we know they dominated them is that how many swords, metal swords, were in Israel at the time that Jonathan and Saul battled? 2. There were no. Jonathan and Saul had the only probably iron swords. I think is what they're referring to. There were probably other types of swords, but iron swords only Jonathan did. Because how many ironsmiths were there in Israel? 0. Because the Philistines controlled it. And how did the Philistines control that? That seems kind of an odd thing to control. Why would that have happened? So I'm going to give you some more history, and this is big picture history. The whole trade in the area started, let's say, in the 1500 BC, which would be 500 years before David. 500 years before, the Mycenaeans up in Greece on the Peloponnese Peninsula are the dominant civilization. If you ever get to go to Greece to the archaeological museum, there's a fabulous museum there that shows the Mycenaean stuff. And when you look at the stuff the Mycenaeans had, you realize that there was already trade developing throughout all of the Aegean Sea, throughout parts of the Mediterranean Sea, all the way to Afghanistan. And so you had trade developing around that area. Shortly after the Mycenaeans, you had the Minoans on the island of Crete. And clearly by the time of the Minoans, they controlled the trade throughout that area. Where do you think the Philistines came from? They were known as the Sea People. They probably came from north, either Crete, maybe partly influenced certainly by the Minoan culture. What technology would that have developed during that time period? Iron making. So when the Philistines came to Israel, they brought with them the skills of iron making. So they just never let it get out of their hands and get over into Israel. It's not as if Israel ever had it to start with. It was that the Philistines had it, not the Israelites. And they just kept control of it. Just like today, Microsoft keeps control of what they have, and so does Google. Everybody keeps control of their technology, gives them a competitive advantage. So between the trade route and the irons, you can see why the Philistines were such a problem to the Israelites. They should have been able to wipe them out. They also had a technology they brought maybe from Egypt, which was chariots. And every once in a while, you'll see what we saw in Judges back in the story of Deborah, where the chariots had iron in them, probably on their wheels to keep them strong. So all over, you're seeing that the Philistines had this incredible advantage. And Saul is a strong enough military leader that he's able to beat them sometimes and keep Israel in as a nation. So I think overall, to me, the question is, when you decide whether Saul's a good king or a bad king, what are going to be your standards of judgment? If you were to say from a military standpoint, you'd have to give Saul high marks. So before we set the standards, we're going to go back to one set of verses in Deuteronomy that I pointed out back in Deuteronomy and said, you guys don't forget this, because when we get to the kings, you're going to want this. You remember Moses said he prophesied that one day the Israelites would want a king. And he told them, he said, there's three things you can't let your kings do. Do you remember the three? Okay. They're easy to remember. You cannot have many wives. You cannot amass much gold. And you cannot amass many horses. That's what the kings were not allowed to do. And they were supposed to stay in the word, in the scriptures. Right, so that was the instructions that Moses gave to the Israelites. So how did Saul do on those three things? He had one wife, as far as we know.
One wife, and I think one concubine, I think. So much better than most of them.
Yeah. But he only had one wife, as far as we know.
I think so.
And he did not amass much horses. So on the checklist from Moses, he did a pretty good job. He did not lead the people into false worship, which all the other kings except maybe David didn't do. When I say maybe David, I don't think David did. But that's not to say he was that he was difficult on false gods either. So in a lot of ways, Saul was a pretty good king. He disobeyed God, as far as we know, 4 times, but that was over 20 to 40 years. So do we know anything about the rest of the things he did? No. The writers, that's not their goal, is to tell us the good things Saul did. Their goal is to tell us the bad things Saul did.
And I noticed this verse popped out kind of along that line of thinking, not maybe getting a lot from Samuel, but there early on when he's being, kind of put in place in chapter 10, verse 7, it says, and it shall be when these signs come to you, where the Spirit comes on you mightily and you prophesy, which all came true right away. It says, do for yourself what the occasion requires, for God is with you. Which in a sense is kind of like, just do what you think's right.
Yep.
Now again, you want to feel that way for him based on the excuses that he gives. And then we learn a little more as you read a little further, that it's because maybe he was fearful of the people. He did disobey. But anyway, that verse stood out to me in the thought that, he was maybe trying to do a good job much of the time.
Yeah, early on. And you can imagine this, the first time he goes off the rails is with the sacrifice. And you read that account and he's waiting. And Samuel said, I'll be there. Samuel's not showing up. And his people are deserting him. He's down to nearly nobody.
Right.
It's not as if he's got his whole army there and says, oh, things are going pretty good. I think I'll just sacrifice. I mean, he was down. He was hanging on by this 10 fingernails, and 2 of them are broken and 8 of them are just barely there. So it's easy. I think if you turn around and look at it in light, it's a lot easier to sympathize with Saul, that he was not that bad of a king on most accounts.
Yeah, I agree.
But what we're going to find out with David is that's not the judgment. That's not the standard God wants to use. Right. Saul pretty well saw the kingship as now the people are his. He's the leader, not God, like the kings around. And what David understood was he was a shepherd of the people under God's direction. That God was the master shepherd. He was just a chief shepherd, and that he would shepherd the people. And he had the heart for that, even though when you compare the two kings on the bad things they did, it's hard to say that David did a whole lot better things than Saul. He had many wives, he amassed much gold, and he had many horses. So, and he killed lots of people, and he maimed a whole lot of people. He was a man of blood, and he lied and he murdered.
And got a lot of people killed because he disobeyed.
Yep.
Yeah.
Phil, it just seems like though that it's the heart that God looks at, because David had a heart following God. Or how does that say? David had a heart for God.
He was a man after God's own heart.
Yes, thank you. Man after God's own heart.
Yeah.
And apparently Saul really wasn't. So it seems like God looked with favor more on David because he had that heart, regardless of what he did. I think that's a good lesson for us. We need to have that kind of a heart. And that covers a lot of sins, it seems, because David had a bunch of them, but that's just my take on it.
Oh, you're tracking exactly. You took it where I was hoping you would go. And that is hard for us. We still want to look at what people do and do as opposed to what their hearts are, because we can't see people's hearts.
Right.
And when we look at our own hearts, it's hard to look at our own hearts and go, okay, I really want to trust my heart. And in fact, we're going to get to some verses here in the Old Testament where it says the heart is deceitful above all things. You cannot trust your heart, but still that's an important part of it. Yeah.
That's what God sees. It's not what we see.
That's right.
I mean, we could get puffed up if we think our hearts are really good. And they're usually not. Yeah.
Unfortunately, not as much as we would like. That's for sure. And partly, maybe we haven't been taught that well enough. We haven't emphasized that, and especially in our day and time now, where it's all about us. The whole society is self-centered. It's hard to be a person after God's own heart. It's not an excuse. It's just something we have to overcome. Yeah.
Okay.
So anyway, those are some of the thoughts. And when I come away with it, if I use every standard but for the heart, Saul's a pretty good king. But when you throw it, people say, well, no, he persecuted David. He was the king. David was one of his guys. He had the right to treat his people any way he wanted to. And so that's, that I think I give him a little slack there. As long as you're king, you're trying to do for your country what you think. And also, he wanted his own son to succeed him. There is something that's going on in here that I hadn't noticed until I started studying David a few years ago. On Mount Gilboa, Saul dies with his 3 sons. But he had 4 sons. So his 4th son, depending on which version you read, was named Ishbosheth. What happens to Ishbosheth after Saul dies?
Doesn't someone make him king at some point? Am I thinking right? Am I remembering right?
Who was Saul's general?
Was that Abner?
Abner, yeah. So Abner leads the charge to keep Ishbosheth as king. And it looks like he's king for 2 years plus or minus. So he and David actually have a civil war going on. And it's not until Ishbosheth gets assassinated, that war is over, and then we're going to see David become king.
Those are interesting stories with all those mighty men, that did all the things that they could do, run really fast, strong, shoot right-handed, left-handed, whatever. But
Yeah, we'll get to those stories, some of them next week. Yeah, when we get into 2 Samuel.
I noticed something, but don't let me turn this away here.
No, go ahead.
Keep on track. I thought this was fun. So it just turns out my daily Bible reading was in Chronicles. And so just recently, right before this lesson that I studied for, and here's that trivia question for you. And it's sort of a trick question, but who killed Saul based on what the Bible says?
Well, in one place it indicates Saul killed himself, and the other place it indicates an Amalekite did.
So we have a guy who runs and tells David, right? That, hey, I can't remember exactly. He was wounded. I finished him off, whatever it was. And of course, we know how David felt about the Lord's anointed. So if you just read that one story, that's who killed Saul. Of course, we don't think that's right because I guess it's a chapter before we read that Saul basically killed himself. He was wounded. He might have died from his wounds, but he killed himself. But in 1 Chronicles 10:14, it says that God killed him, which it says because of the things that he had, the sins that he had committed, which again, that's why that's kind of a trick question, because they're not conflicting with each other necessarily, but it just kind of popped out at me in the study.
Yeah, that's a great trivia question. So we have 3 choices.
Right. And I think really 2 of them are the same, but one of them was a made up story from someone who I think wanted to get some glory or a reward or something. And then the other 2 are, both true, I think.
And I would say, I think the Amalekite was right. I think he was telling the truth.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And 2 reasons I think that's true is the Philistines don't strip the body until the next day, right? And so somewhere between his death and the stripping, the Amalekite ends up with the stuff of Saul's.
See that? Don't they cut off his head and take his armor
The next day.
and then, yeah, right.
So whatever the Amalekite had of Saul's, he got before that happened. So he had been around, he had been up with Saul before, and he may not have killed Saul, but he was definitely there. And the reason I think he killed Saul is because David thought he did.
Interesting. I think I remember Mitch preaching on that, and I want to say maybe it wasn't Mitch. I'm just giving him credit for all sermons I hear, I guess these days. But I thought he talked about how that guy might have been. But yeah, we don't know, I guess, for sure. And if you look at 1 Chronicles 10:13, it says, so Saul died for his trespass, which he committed against the Lord, because of the word of the Lord, which he did not keep, and also because he asked counsel of a medium. So I guess you could add a 4th one and say because of his trespasses or disobedience. But
Right.
And again, they're not really separate. They're really all tied together. So maybe they're all right. All 4 of them. I don't know.
One of the things that is we're going to talk about next week, hopefully, is the Amalekites and what happens to them, because I think they're an interesting group to follow. So if I don't do a good job about bringing that up next week, don't let me forget to talk about that, because there's some really cool aspects of that story that I think deserve talking about. And part of it is this right here, where an Amalekite maybe is the one that kills the Lord's anointed. I believe that's true, isn't it, Brent?
What's
And the
that?
guy that goes to David, it's next week. It's in next week.
That's a great question, because we were talking about it on the van coming back from Muskogee this afternoon, and they were thinking it was an Egyptian, and I didn't take time to look it up before I got here.
Okay, let's look at that real quick. Ladanta, Bible search. Where do you think that is?
Have any idea?
Well, let's look at 2 Samuel. It's either going to be in 2 Samuel or yeah.
David learned of Saul this, 2 Samuel 1.
15?
Oh no, it's in 8. 2 Samuel 1:8. He responded, "Who are you?" "I am an Amalekite," I told him.
Yeah.
Then he begged me, "Come over here and put me out of my misery, for I'm in terrible pain and want to die." So I killed him, for I knew he couldn't live. Then I took his crown and his armband, and I brought them here to you, my Lord.
Mm.
Yeah, I'm really going to have to study this now that you've challenged me to think that maybe both of these things are true. Because it's 31 where Saul died with his 3 sons, his armor bearer, and all his men on that day together. But your point is he was there on that day, potentially, so he could have been a part of it.
Well, he had to be there that day, or the body would have been stripped,
Right.
or he wouldn't have been able to get to it the next day.
Right.
And then David in 16 says, "You have condemned yourself, for you yourself confessed that you killed the Lord's anointed one." So anyway, I'm not sure. It makes a good set of trivia questions. Who are the 4 possibilities for who killed Saul?
Yeah, I thought so too. I enjoyed thinking about it. Well, I shouldn't say it that way. Now I feel weird for saying it that way. But anyway, it's just trying to love God's word and understand what he's telling us, right?
Yeah.
In that context.
And have a trivia question you use at a party that nobody can answer.
Exactly. Hey, I would have answered that he killed himself. That'd be my straight up answer. He fell on his own sword because he was wounded. That'd have been my short answer. But anyway.
Okay. So is there anything else about the lesson, the video that you guys saw you wanted to visit about or talk about? We've got time for anything.
I thought it was another neat thought. Well, again, this video had, for me, lots of little, like so many of them do, little things to make me think about these being people, and not just faceless or characters in a story. But I thought it was neat to talk. I say neat again, not the right sentiment, but we talked about the group wondering themselves what was inside the ark after it came back. And of course they died for that because they violated the command. But again, it made me think of why they would do that. Well, that's a pretty reasonable, you just got it back. What did they do to it? Or did they take stuff out of it that we know is supposed to be there and all that kind of stuff? So that was interesting. And I don't know that I would have called Saul a farm boy, but I like that reference because it reminds me where he comes from and what he did.
Yeah, he was a rich farm boy though. I hadn't caught that before this
Because
last
of all
week.
the oxen and all of that.
Well, but it says he was rich.
Yeah, I didn't even realize that.
Yeah. Let's see.
I didn't catch it either.
Yeah, and chapter 9, verse 1. There was a wealthy, influential man named Kish from the tribe of Benjamin. So that was his father.
Yeah, sure.
So he was tall, dark, handsome, and rich. He had it all going for him.
Hey, I'm going to run. My daughter's here. I'm taking her to dinner for her birthday.
Oh, good. I'm glad. Thanks for joining us. I knew you were maybe not going to be here, Ladeta. Appreciate it.
No, I always enjoy your
Where are you going?
Bill.
Just so I know.
I don't know. I told Michelle to decide and she hadn't decided yet, she said. So would you have any recommendations?
Oh, man.
that we can afford?
Well, you eat everywhere I eat.
I,
Let's see. Well, Red Rock's always good.
yes, yes. She
Uh,
thought about that one, she said.
is there a special kind of food you like?
She likes it all. But she does eat healthy. I'll have to give her credit for that. So most of the time, she said.
Well, Charleston's, I like Keogh's sometimes. That's pretty good down on Peoria. Asian food. It's pretty good.
Oh, I don't, Keogh,
Uh-huh.
have you eaten there, Michelle? Where is it on Peoria? You're on Lewis. What'd you say?
No, it's not. There's one at 95th, I'm sorry, 89th and Yale, or there's one on Brookside.
Okay, I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
So
Amanda
that's-
took me there one time. Yeah.
Okay. It's pretty good.
Yeah. Okay, we'll figure it out.
Torchy's Tacos is always a crowd favorite here. So, all right. Well, have a
Oh,
good
yeah.
time.
Okay.
Happy
Yes.
birthday, Michelle.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
So Brent, whoop, Brent,
Yes,
where'd you go?
I'm still here. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but you went away on viewing.
I still see myself at the top of your screen.
Yeah, my screen went away. Okay. Have you looked into the book I gave you, or did I give you a copy of the Misreading Scripture with Individualized Eyes?
I put that in my to buy list, but I have not received it.
Oh, okay. Well, I've been carrying around extra copies and giving them away. So
I don't think we bought it. If you have a copy, I'll steal it from you.
Oh, I've bought over 100 copies already and given them away. So I
No
still have.
kidding. Yeah, I'm
How
looking forward.
am I going to get
to
it to you? That's what I need to do.
I'm looking forward to it. I'm trying to finish this geography book I mentioned to you that you said you couldn't get through. I'm trying to go ahead and get through it, but I keep getting bogged down. But anyway,
Let me see real quick. What do I have here? Do you have lunch available either Thursday or Friday?
let's look. And you're still recording. If that
Yeah, I'll go ahead and unrecord.